thank you all for joining us today and welcome to our panel, Marriage and Divorce in Gasboom, Muncie. Just before I begin the introduction, one housekeeping announcement. So you should, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You can see down at the bottom of your screen. We'll be collecting those throughout the presentations. And then at the end of the three, I'll read them out and we can enjoy them and answer them together. I will also introduce each presenter as we go along. And then at the end, I have a couple minutes of questions just to sort of draw everything together and help us think about the fantastic research that we're going to hear about. And then we'll open up the floor to answering the questions that are in the Q&A. So do please think about questions that you have that focus on the content of the presentations, but also on the process. I mean, this is very much meant to be an opportunity to not just think about the past, but think about how we understand the past, how we do history, how we work as historians, and what that work tells us about ourselves and our society. How we understand the past is integrally related to what we think about it. So please do put your reflections and your questions in the Q&A. The chat won't get to us, so Q&A is what you're looking for. Okay, so here we go. Once again, welcome. It's great to have so many people here. And the three papers that you'll hear from today come from work that was done in a fall 2020 section of History 200, Introduction to History and Historical Methods. So students in this class collaborated to produce 6 video biographies that focus on women who lived in Muncie from 1870 to 1920 CE. The biographies included working class women and upper class women, Catholic and Protestant women, and Black and white women. And this work told us a great deal about the lived experience, or really what it was like to be a woman at that time and in that place. And as you know, Muncie is very idiosyncratic in many ways, at the same time that it's held up as a model. It's sort of weird. Now, indeed, one of the things that we discovered is that the standard narrative of women marrying once and for life was not necessarily widespread in Muncie at this time. So today we'll explore 3 case studies that tell us more about marriage, divorce, and female agency in this time and place. So our first presenter is Hailey Bigerstaff, who is a double history and social studies teaching major, and she collaborated on the Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin project. And I should note that if you want to see any of these projects, you can go to the Town on Fire online Omeka exhibit. Just Google Town on Fire, Ball State, and you should be able to find it. Today, Hailey will discuss with us the impact of divorce on professional women in early 20th century Muncie. Thank you very much, Hailey. Take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Hailey Bigerstaff, and today I'm going to be discussing the impact of divorce on professional women in early 20th century Muncie, but specifically the impact on the life of Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin. So let me share my screen here with you. There we go. All right, so in the fall semester of 2020, my Introduction to History and Historical Methods classmates and I were given the opportunity to contribute to the Notable Women Project of Delaware County. My group with Lauren Latham and Elizabeth Dupire was assigned Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin, a trusted physician in Muncie at the turn of the century. She was, at least, until she attempted to divorce her husband in 1903. What ensued impacted every aspect of her life, including her reputation in the community, her livelihood, and her mental health. When we began doing research on her life, we thought we might be able to find information about her medical practice, her patients, and her standing in the community. And while we were able to locate a few such sources, we quickly realized that many more sources existed detailing her drawn-out divorce from her husband, William, and his subsequent retaliation. It became clear that the community was much more concerned about Dr. Lemon Griffin's failings as a wife than it was about her accomplishments as a doctor. She was ultimately driven out of Muncie for good, institutionalized at times, and labeled a drug addict. While she did eventually return to practicing medicine, she never again rose to the level she had attained before her divorce. This all led me to ponder whether the events that transpired would have played out the same way for her if she were a housewife, or whether smearing her name would have been as severe if she were even a working class woman compared to a medical professional. Her divorce and the scandal that followed ultimately defined her life, and that was true for many professional women at the turn of the 20th century. In order to properly understand her experience as a professional divorcee and why it was so extreme by today's standards, one must understand public opinion about divorce in Muncie at the time. According to this September 11th, 1899 article from the Muncie Morning News, the extraordinary number of divorce cases on the Delaware County Court docket was branded a public disgrace by Reverend C.M. Carter of the Muncie First Baptist Church. Apparently, the church was filled to overflowing on the night in question as he delivered a fiery sermon about the perils of divorce and the immorality that led to it. In this sermon, he also advocated for stricter divorce legislation in the community and stated that the only acceptable reason for a divorce is adultery, not drunkenness and not cruelty. This ideology could also be seen mirrored by the Delaware County Circuit Court in 1903 when Anna's request for a divorce was denied, even though she cited cruelty, neglect, and adultery as reasons for seeking legal separation from her husband. What this all demonstrates is the way in which religious ideology shaped public opinion and even court proceedings in Muncie at the time. According to the award-winning author and historian who was actually here last year, Kimberly Hamlin, in debates about women's intellect and rights, as well as in discussions regarding the proper distribution of domestic and professional work, what people were really talking about was motherhood, actual or potential, and the extent to which it did or should determine every aspect of a woman's life. In a time period where women had not yet won the right to vote nationwide, women's roles were still very narrowly defined and often hinged on whether or not a woman married or had children. Being a mother was still seen as a woman's ultimate purpose, though that was beginning to change. When women like Anna Lemon Griffin elected to forego having children to pursue professional success, they were often demonized by the larger culture and accused of going against nature and against God. This ideology was even more pronounced when it came to women attaining college degrees in fields that were traditionally dominated by men, such as medicine. Historian Lynn D. Gordon of the University of Rochester stated in her 1987 article in American Quarterly titled "The Gibson Girl Goes to College, Popular Culture and Women's Higher Education in the Progressive Era, 1890 to 1920, that many shared the view that college women had unsexed themselves, if not biologically, then at least culturally and socially. With rising divorce rates across the country, many of these professional women were also seen as contributing directly to the degradation of the institution of marriage and the American family. Now that women could be more economically independent, they had more say regarding their reproductive rights and their individual goals. For our research on Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin, it was very important that we be able to establish her as a successful and respected physician in the community prior to her divorce. Luckily, we were able to locate several primary sources that succeeded in this. First, an excerpt from the Emerson Muncie City Directory from the years of 1899 to 1900 listed Mrs. Anna Lemon Griffin as a practicing physician and surgeon at 115 Jefferson Street in Muncie. Please note that she is listed here as Mrs. and not as a doctor. But if she were not a reputable and well-respected doctor at the time, she likely would not have continued to be listed in the directory for Muncie citizens to call on her, which she was for several years. Second, an excerpt from an article in the Daily Herald in 1896 discusses Anna's contribution to a meeting of the Delaware County Medical Society, where she was held in high regard by the other physicians in attendance because of her anatomical descriptions of the scalp at the conference. This suggests that she was at least good at her job and that she was respected by other doctors in the community. The third piece of such evidence was a sworn statement written to the Delaware County Circuit Court of Indiana by Dr. Lemon Griffin in 1900, when one of her pregnant patients was a witness in a murder trial. All three of these primary sources certainly helped us to establish Anna Lemon Griffin as a respected doctor in Muncie before her 1905 divorce. As previously mentioned, Anna attempted in 1903 to secure a divorce from her husband William and was denied, even though she claimed he had been cruel, neglectful, and adulterous during their marriage. By the time her husband filed for divorce himself in 1905, the rumor mill in Muncie was churning. Stories about her alleged threats of physical violence, her morphine use, and more were printed in newspapers not only in Muncie, but all across the country. It is unclear whether William's claims about Anna were 100% factual, simply a successful campaign to slander her name and ruin her life, or perhaps even as a means to finally obtain the divorce that they had previously been denied. With articles being released in Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Montana, among other places, it must have seemed nearly impossible for Anna to escape her past and move on with her life. Indeed, her career never fully recovered from this. In doing research on the life of Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin, one thing that particularly struck me was the fact that there are very few primary sources that provided any kind of firsthand account of her experience. Aside from the statement that she provided for her patient's court proceedings and the formal complaint that she wrote about her husband when she attempted to divorce him, the most significant piece of evidence that established her perception of events was a newspaper article from the Star Press in Muncie on August 18, 1906. In this article, called Says Ex-Husband is Shadowing Her, Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin is described as a former Muncie practitioner who is very ill and penniless and involved in a distressing situation in Kokomo while traveling from Muncie to Logansport. She even enlisted the help of a local sheriff because she was so convinced that her ex-husband was stalking her. This one piece of evidence informs us not only about Anna's state of mind at the time, but also lingering public opinion about her divorce from William. The most important part of this article, however, is the direct quote from Anna herself describing what her life had been like since her journey to divorce William began. She is quoted in saying, "I have been shadowed continuously for 5 years. There has not been an hour in at least 5 years that I have not been sure someone was spying on me. I have gone all over the country and I have acted in as secret a manner as possible, but some pursuer has dogged my footsteps. Although I am a woman, I am a graduate physician, and I at one time enjoyed a large and lucrative practice. All that is gone now. I have nothing but a few books and my instruments, and the constant watching has reduced me to the nervous wreck that you see before you." This passage, while almost difficult to read because of the sheer hopelessness you can tell that she feels, establishes that she did at one time consider herself to be extremely successful in the medical profession. It's unclear, however, whether the sheriff she spoke to in Kokomo believed her distress or did anything to stop William from following her. In fact, it's not even really clear whether William was following her in the first place. This is where the accusations of morphine addiction and threats of violence make me scratch my head and wonder, is all of this really happening to her, or is it just some kind of drug-fueled paranoia? She is described in the article as wasted and shaking, but these terms have have very different meanings now than they did when the article was written. So, we might misinterpret that today. It is possible that she is simply at her wit's end after years of being harassed by her ex-husband. Indeed, that would be enough to make anyone lose their mind. In addition to all of these newspaper articles defaming her, there were also multiple sources that pointed to Anna being institutionalized for mental health issues at different times following her divorce. The first mention of her being institutionalized actually comes from the July to December 1906 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association, where it is stated that Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin is a former practitioner of Muncie, but that she has been sent to the state hospital at Logansport by the authorities of Kokomo. It is also mentioned that she is believed to be temporarily deranged and not currently practicing medicine. This timing was interesting to me because it appears to line up almost exactly with the newspaper article about her seeking assistance from the authorities in Kokomo. It remains unclear, but it seems highly possible that the very authorities whose help she enlisted to protect her from her stalking ex-husband determined that she was in fact mentally unfit and sent her away to be institutionalized. Does this confirm then that William was not stalking her and that she was indeed suffering from some kind of paranoid mental break? The extant sources do not indicate one way or the other, but the timing is difficult to ignore. There is another source that indicates a separate institutionalization in 1908. A state hospital inquest found in the Indiana Digital Archives asserts that Anna received a psychiatric evaluation from the Central State Hospital in Indianapolis on August 13th, 1908, and was subsequently institutionalized once again. As before, there isn't really an explanation given for why, so we are left to speculate about the possibilities. It is difficult to determine whether she was suffering from severe mental health issues, morphine addiction, or simply being profiled based on the accusations made about her in newspapers in years past. While it is unclear exactly how long she was hospitalized, United States Census records from 1910 and 1920 indicate that Anna lived out the rest of her life after her release on her brother's farm near Fort Wayne, Indiana. She died of erysipelas on May 14th, 1923 in Paulding County, Ohio at the age of 65. She never remarried, and really, who could blame her? Rather than Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin's life being emblematic of the experience of women doctors in the Midwestern United States in the early 1900s, her life appears to be much more emblematic of the ease with which professional women could fall from grace. In the span of just a few years, she went from being a respected member of the Muncie community to a divorcee spurned by rumors spread by her ex-husband. This all completely upended her life, both professionally and personally. It became quite clear as this project unfolded that a divorced woman would have found it difficult to maintain a good reputation at the time, even if the divorce was completely warranted. No matter how highly respected they were in the community previously, that could all be undone very easily. At the onset of this project, I hoped that we might be able to find information about Dr. Anna Lemon Griffin's medical practice or the environmental impacts that industrialization was having on the people of Muncie in the early 20th century. We certainly did not expect for our project to end up being centered around divorce and defamation. And yet that part of her life appears to have been just as poignant in her experience as becoming a doctor. Regrettably, much more information remains about her divorce, domestic disputes, alleged drug use, and derangement than anything else. There are no extant pictures of her face that were found in the process of this research, and yet newspaper articles defaming her abound. Notice, however, that none of the stories that we found mentioned whether or not she was a good physician. The allegations against her had much more to do with her unfit quality as a wife, and in early 1900s America, her skill as a physician was of secondary importance to her domestic failings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hailey. That was very thought-provoking. And I'm sure that we'll have many questions about not just what you have argued, but how you have visualized it for us today. Okay, so our second presenter is Virginia Carter, who is a history major and who worked on the Carrie Gillenwaters project. Today, Virginia will share with us her presentation entitled Carrie Gillenwaters, Marriage, Divorce, and Domestic Violence in Racially Charged Print Culture. Please join me in welcoming her. Virginia?
So while conducting research for the Notable Women of Delaware County project, the facet of our notable woman, Carrie Gillenwaters' life that struck us both in the vividity of available written record and its subversion of our assumption about early 20th century life was her marriages. Being a twice married and twice divorced woman, Carrie Gillenwaters' life demonstrated how the politics surrounding marriage, divorce, intimate partner violence and the interaction of these issues with race played out in real life and on the stage of Muncie's racially segregated newspaper. So for some background on Carrie's life and why we found her to be such an interesting contradiction of our expectations of African-American female life and autonomy in early 20th century Indiana. Carrie and her family were among the over 5,000 African Americans who moved to Muncie between 1886 and the 1890s, seeking job opportunities created by the gas boom and the subsequent rapid industrial growth of Muncie. After moving to Indiana from Kentucky sometime between 1886 and 1890, Carrie shared a home with her mother and three brothers on East Seymour Street in Muncie, of which her mother is listed as the head of household on 2 census records. All members of the household, including Carrie, worked. As was typical for recent migrants to Muncie, her brothers worked primarily in factories, while Carrie and her mother, Leanna, who is sometimes referred to as Anna, were domestic employees. As a teenager, Carrie worked as a caretaker for the children of the Marsh Ryan family, a wealthy and influential family headed by one of Muncie's first bankers. It is from this job that we have the only found photograph of Carrie, a rare recorded instance of interaction between an African-American domestic servant and the white family they worked for. We were surprised to then find Carrie listed as a student in an Indiana normal school, which is now Ball State, catalog from 1907 to 1908. In being one of only 347 students, as well as a working class woman of color, Carrie forced us to reassess and confront the assumptions we'd entered this project with, assuming that employment with a family as influential as the Marsh Ryans and access to higher education would have been out of the question for someone like her. Further challenging our preconceptions of what people of color and women were able to do in Indiana at this time was the discovery that Carrie Gillenwaters had been married and divorced twice, both times being the party to plea for and be granted divorce by a judge. According to marriage licenses and newspaper articles, Carrie was first married to Ernest Rickman in 1912, who she divorced in 1917, and then to William Worlds later that same year. She divorced Worlds as well in 1923 and took custody of his daughter, who she had adopted 2 years earlier. We approached Carrie's experience with divorce through the societal, legal, and cultural factors that might have made seeking divorce difficult for her. Our understanding of the 1920s being one of conservatism and rigid, traditionally Protestant attitudes towards marriage. Indeed, the early 20th century was defined by many Americans as a time of fear for the American family model. There was widespread outrage and suspicion over what was dubbed trial marriages or companionate marriages, marked by the quick marriage of two young people who saw divorce as an easy out if their affection for one another ran out. There were very few people who had self-proclaimed trial marriages, but the idea of their existence and the threat they held to the so-called sanctity of marriage prompted government and church intervention. Judges would sometimes even accuse couples of having trial marriages in order to deny them a divorce. One New York Supreme Court Justice, Ernest Edgecombe, said in 1924, quote, "It is better that a few be made to suffer and lie in the bed which they voluntarily made, than to break down the walls which the church and civilization has brought up around the marriage contract." We don't know how Carrie felt about trial marriages or if she classified her own marriages to be such, but we can see through this phenomenon how public opinion and judicial misrepresentation might have been seen as barriers to her. We might, by our interpretation of the decades that followed the Victorian era, be led to infer that Carrie and others' divorces following the turn of the century were the result of the shedding of what historian Elaine May refers to as the Victorian ethos, the highly gendered framework of modest, hardworking social achievement that planted itself so successfully in the white Protestant American middle class. But to understand how Carrie might or might not have fit into this idea, we must draw a distinction between those who lived during the Victorian era and those who were Victorians. May asserts that the working class rarely had time and money enough to participate in the philanthropical and domestic activities that defined Victorian households. We know that Carrie's mother, Anna, listed herself as divorced on one census record, and there is no evidence to suggest that she was married any time while living in Muncie. Though Anna grew up during the height of the Victorian era, when divorce was quite rare, she would have experienced pressure outside of the Victorian value placed on marriage. The pressure to have a partner capable of contributing to their income and to provide resources enough to raise children. Considering how Carrie and her mother might have experienced the Victorian era, their divorces might not have been so much a result of its end as the continuation of their household's dependency on them beyond the moral instruction and cosmetic upkeep that defined Victorian marriage and motherhood. In both her petitions for divorce, Carrie cited ill treatment, claiming that Ernest had gambled away their money and that William had been violent and cruel, even threatening to kill her once while drunk. We know from newspaper clippings that Ernest was involved in several public domestic disputes, some claiming that he forced his attentions on a young woman. One report in 1911, a year before their marriage, included Carrie and detailed a fight between them on a street in Muncie. Both were arrested, but Carrie, who had managed to cut Ernest with a knife, was charged and fined $1. By the time Carrie had entered her first marriage in 1912, the Protective Agency for Women and Children, the first and only organization started in the 19th century dedicated to protecting women from domestic violence and spousal abuse, had been absorbed by the Legal Aid Society of Chicago, which was vocal in discouraging divorce regardless of circumstance. Though first-wave feminism had endeavored to bring violence against women to the public's attention, many prominent first-wave feminists were reluctant to include African-American women in that conversation. Temperance movements then refocused on family violence, which was addressed through correlating factors like poverty and alcohol consumption. Historian Elizabeth Pleck wrote, quote, "With the disappearance of rhetoric about evil beasts and social purity, the emotional outrage required to generate a public campaign was gone. Only after another 80 years would feminists renew their sisterhood with victims of crimes against women." One key factor that detracted feminist attention from domestic violence was the rise of social work and psychology as fields with which domestic violence could be addressed professionally. As previously mentioned, Carrie adopted her second husband's daughter, Frances, who was from a previous marriage in 1921, and then petitioned for custody of her in her plea for divorce in 1923. Her want to maintain guardianship over Frances might have stemmed from concern over possible abuse from William, which she cited, or a maternal instinct or affinity for caring for children that had made her crucial in the Marsh Ryan home. She became, as her mother had been, the primary breadwinner, head of household, and a single mother to Frances. Women who acted as the primary or sole breadwinner for their families were often the recipients of aid from welfare societies, and were therefore often monitored by caseworkers, who both individually and through the larger organization they represented imposed their own ideas of what made a good mother. The necessity of earning money sometimes conflicted with the expectations of keeping a clean home and dedicating time to instructing children in proper moral conduct. And there is a pronounced discrepancy between how cases of Euro and African American families were handled. One particular instance of this inconsistency is described by Karen Tice of New York University in the case of a Minneapolis mother named Rosa, who had to act as the sole source of income for her family. 15 years worth of recorded meetings with her caseworker show how, as Rosa worked a day and night job 6 days a week, the caseworker continuously berated the state of the home and Rosa's absence, claiming it to be dirty and the children to be ill-mannered, and once implying this deplorable situation to be cause enough for the removal of her children. Meanwhile, the director of this same aid organization pushed a project that she called the Wise Parenthood Among the Humble Folk, which praised several allegorical white women for their determination to work in order to provide for their family. When a woman of color, like Rosa, like Carrie, showed the same ambition, she was negligent. There is no record of Carrie having any contact with a similar family welfare society or organization, but we can see through other working class women of color's experiences the kind of external pressure Carrie was placed under in taking on the sole guardianship of her adopted daughter. Who she was as a mother is also unknowable, although we have one recorded instance of Carrie hosting a birthday party for Frances. We know these details regarding Carrie's marriages and much of the information we have on her life because of the nature of newspaper during this period. Newspapers weren't just used for spreading news of the wider world to a community, but also for alerting the community of the comings and goings of its citizens. Information we might now deem too personal for the public was printed, such as guests invited to someone's house for dinner, or a family's personal travel plans, or in Carrie's case, marital conflict. Most of our narrative of Carrie's life comes from the In Colored Circles section of the Muncie Star Press. When discussing how African American life was portrayed in the Muncie paper, especially as we try to sketch a person's life and something as intimate as marriage with it, it is important to remember the state of race relations in Muncie and Indiana at this time. The Ku Klux Klan had a dominant presence throughout Indiana in the 1920s. The Indiana Klan was actually the largest chapter in the United States in the year 1920. Nativist attitudes likely impacted the way in which newspapers reported on issues like domestic violence, which Carrie experienced in both of her marriages. The result of separating Black and white communities in the newspaper and printing the intimate details of their lives was the strengthening of harmful stereotypes that insinuated violence in Black men and victimhood in Black women. Going into this project, we were skeptical that any detailed information about the life of an African American woman in 1920s Muncie would be available. But we were wrong in this respect, finding a wealth of newspaper entries that describe detailed aspects and events of Gillenwaters' life. While these newspaper articles offered us the kind of vivid anecdotes that we were unlikely to find elsewhere, the subject matters favored and the way in which they were addressed seemed intentional and in stark contrast to the rest of the newspaper. Details of public violent domestic disputes between Carrie and her husband, her statements to the judge while pleading for divorce, and a record of her family and other Black families' failure to pay their property taxes painted a grave picture of both her married and domestic life. Being aware of the problematic stereotypes, a sketch of Gillenwaters and by extension other Black women's lives based solely on these details might bring to mind, we then turned to secondary sources on the use of print to problematize and socialize the Black community with the normalization of domestic violence and marital degradation. Historian David Ponton writes, quote, "This violence against Black women through publishing undoubtedly participated in the racial and gender socialization of Black girls and women, suggesting to them that intimate partner violence was a fact of life, that Black women had to be exceptionally strong. They would suffer their fates alone and without the advocacy of people who had more power in public spaces." While newspaper offers critical insight into the lives of those who would otherwise be unrecorded, we must keep in mind how they might have impacted Carrie and others in her community. What we then concluded was that there was a threefold effect of racially segregated newspaper and its focus on crime, intimate partner violence, and marital conflict. The first was its effect on the surrounding larger white community, who might have seen this content as confirmation of prejudice that ruled Muncie in the 1920s. The second was the impact of this prejudice on the Black community, manifesting physically as socioeconomic disadvantage and mentally building on existing complex issues of racial trauma. The third was something we feel might have affected Carrie Gillenwaters the most: the expectations and victimized roles that this reporting pressed on young African American women. Thus, Carrie Gillenwaters' experience with marriage, divorce, and domestic violence provides us not only with an example of how women in the early 20th century might have resisted the normalization of domestic violence by seeking divorce during a time when divorces were under extreme scrutiny, but also how their behaviors and beliefs around marriages and domestic violence might have been influenced by racially motivated journalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virginia. That was fantastic. And I hope that we can come back later on in this panel to that idea of charged print, both in terms of race and gender. So on that note, our third presenter is Carrie Norwald, a double history and social studies teaching major who collaborated on the Kate Finney project, another project that uses a lot of newspapers, and I hope can tell us more about this issue of how they work. So today, Kara will discuss the deviance and social stigmas of divorce in Muncie, Kate Finney's story, 1870 to 1920. Take it away, Kara.
All right. Oh, sorry. Hello, my name is Carrie Nahrwold. My group and I presented over Kate Finney in fall 2020. And we had no idea what we were getting ourselves into because Kate Finney was notable, but not for reasons that anyone would likely suspect. So to begin with, Kate Finney had many aliases. She was Kate Finney, Catherine Clark after her first marriage, Catherine Woolf after her second marriage, and right before her death, she was Rebecca Dolby. So for my group, it was difficult to track her down besides her extensive criminal records and articles written about her and her scandalous second marriage, which all took place in Muncie. She had no pictures taken of her, so that was another hoop to jump through, and it took a while for us to get to really know who Kate Finney was. It was apparent to us as a working woman, Kate Finney had to protect herself and did not want to become close with anyone. However, my group and I were finally able to track down some census records that said that Kate Finney was born around 1863 in Pennsylvania. She moved to Anderson, Indiana with her sister. We assume it's her sister because she went by the name Little Finney. And then to Muncie, right sometime before 1900, after getting married to William Clark, her first husband. William Clark, her first husband, was thought to egg on her criminal mischief. So Kate Finney was known to have many run-ins with the laws because she was a witness to many prostitution-like cases. She had many public drunkenness or public intoxication charges, and she was even charged for attempted murder. Kate Finney did leave Muncie to move to Indianapolis, however, where she died in 1927 of uremia, or kidney failure, due to her excessive drinking. However, she was buried in Beech Grove Cemetery in Muncie, Indiana, likely with her brother in an unmarked grave. It was a challenge to try to find the exact grave where she was. So my group member Brenna Hailey, she called several cemeteries trying to find where Kate Finney was, but nobody really knew what she was talking about, just because Kate Finney was that elusive and she didn't want anybody to know where she was. It was through census records and an obituary that we finally figured out where Kate Finney was buried. So this is a picture of her obituary and where she is likely buried. As stated before, we're not exactly if this is where she's buried precisely, but based on the census records and the obituary, it's very likely she's likely buried underneath one of those trees right there. So as stated before, one of the first ways my group and I were able to track down who Kate Finney was or what the public thought of her was through her criminal record and newspapers written about her. Kate Finney ran a house of ill repute, or as it's also known as her joint. And from what we know about the developing red light district in Muncie around this time is that she had a great influence on it. One of Kate's most notorious crimes was when a man did not pay for his services at her joint. And so she put a gun in his mouth and shot him, ultimately being tried and acquitted for attempted murder. A similar story to this is about a man, again, not paying for his services at her joint, and she threw acid in his face. Kate was also the subject of being involved in assault and battery charges, in addition to public intoxication charges. On this slide, there are some newspaper clippings of some of her public intoxication and assault charges. So on the picture to the left, it's Kate Finney being arrested for assaulting somebody while being intoxicated. In the lower right picture, it's Kate Finney is the follow-up to that where she is put to trial and made to pay a fine. And the picture on the top right is her another assault and battery charge that Kate had, but she was sober this time. She was trying to let her acquitted because she was going after a man who, again, refused to pay for his services. So Kate Finney was pretty much the opposite of what people would define as social norms at this time. Kate Finney was married twice. So I talked about her first husband, William Clark, a little bit in the beginning. He thought to egg her on with her criminal activities and mischief and things like that. However, he sadly died of pneumonia kind of suddenly in 1915. And when he died, he left Kate a small fortune of money. Soon after her husband's death, Kate got married once again to a man named Taylor Woolf, and they had a private courthouse ceremony with a huge, as I like to call it, a Gatsby-like party, because there were many people in attendance, and it was very clear that they spent a lot of money on it. So after about a year, Kate's brother Grant saw something bad about the marriage, and he said that Kate was incapacitated when she got married to Taylor, and that in a sense she was tricked into marrying him. Grant wanted guardianship over Kate because he felt that Taylor Woolf was only with her for her money. So their marriage was annulled and her brother was granted guardianship. And the articles on the left, the article says that Catherine Woolf petitions for divorce from Taylor. In the middle, it's the claim from Kate's brother Grant that Taylor Woolf was only with Kate for her money, and he started a petition for guardianship. And then finally on the right, the annulment went through and Grant was granted full guardianship over Kate. When my group and I were researching this, we thought it was interesting how Taylor Woolf, the allegation that Taylor Woolf was only with Kate for her money and the likely boost of social standing, because that's something that women mainly took part in during this time, and it's very unlikely that a man would get married for somebody just for their money. So Kate Finney was thought to be a terrible person by most of the people living in Muncie at this time. They thought she was a terrible influence and she should just leave due to her excessive criminal record and very promiscuous behavior. As stated earlier, Kate Finney did end up leaving Muncie and moving to Indianapolis. And my group tried to find a link of why she tried to leave. We assumed she got driven out of town, but we were unable to prove this. But we were unable to. In this slide, Kate Finney's threatened with being white capped, and no, it does not have anything to do with the Ku Klux Klan, unfortunately. And what that essentially means is that she's being threatened to be forcibly evicted out of town by this group called the Defenders of Right. The Defenders of Right was a group with very similar values to the Ku Klux Klan. And at first my group did think it was the Ku Klux Klan who tried to drive her out of town, but it was then we found the link to the Defenders of Right. So they are not the same. So yeah, like I said, we wanted to find the link, but sadly we were unable to. So in this article, the Defenders of Right want Kate Finney and her entire family, because at this time she was divorced, just to leave Muncie, because she's a terrible influence and a burden on society. It was clear at this point in our research that Kate Finney was widely hated by most of the people in Muncie just because of who she was. The women's clubs in Muncie were starting to develop, and after many families in Muncie the women's clubs in Muncie were starting to develop after many families moved after the gas boom, as a way for women to connect with other women other than church on Sunday morning. In the book, and What Middletown Read by Dr. Connolly, as we read in History 200, the women's club in Muncie was just a place for women to just get together. The father of the kids watches the kids for a night, and the women get to come together and do stuff for the community, like put on plays. So these clubs are mainly formed by middle-class white women, and they were different clubs that they could all join, all supported by the Muncie Public Library. There were book clubs, travel clubs, etc. One of these clubs is essential for Kate's story, and that was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union's mission was to keep Muncie as pure as possible. They supported the temperance movement and the Protestant values that accompanied it. As a result, they also likely hated Kate Finney because she was a symbol of impurity by running her joint and having a criminal record. My group and I wanted to link the Women's Christian Union to the Defenders of Right because I was sure that maybe the Defenders of Right and the Women's Christian Union, they were like married or something, but we were unable to find that link. There were a lot of dead ends in this research project. It made me really mad. So yeah, they just hated Kate. They all hated Kate. So as stated before, from what we know about Muncie's developing boomtown in the red light district, it's clear that Kate Finney had some sort of impact on it. Muncie's red light district is especially important as it's close to other big districts like Chicago, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. While the location of Kate's joint is unknown, we can assume based on other boomtowns that it was close to factories, as barns and saloons were also close to the area due to men getting off work and grabbing a drink, and sometimes getting drunk and picking up a prostitute, but this was not all the time. On this slide, there's a map of Kate's likely locations. This is a Sanborn map. The pink building is what my group and I assume to be a factory, along with some shops along the street. My group and I believe that Kate's location is one of the little yellow bars that I've circled. either across the street or down the street. Additionally, it should be noted that Kate Finney was also friends with another notorious prostitute mentioned in what Middletown read. Her name was Little Flo Blair. Little Flo Blair was an immigrant, and she stayed with Kate for a while she sorted some things in her life. But I just think it's interesting how these two notorious prostitutes who were both widely hated kind of knew each other, and they were friends, and they lived together for a period of time. All right, so this slide is important to note that Kate Finney was a product of her time. We need to put her in the context of the temperance movement and the gas boom in Muncie. So this helps me try to put everything into context and keep track of everything going on simultaneously. So in 1861, the temperance movement begins with protests of women wanting alcohol to be legal. I'll talk more about the temperance movement in the next slide. So in 1863 in Pennsylvania, Kate Finney is born right into the temperance movement. In 1887, a natural gas was discovered in Muncie, leading to more unmarried men and families moving here. As a result, in 1890, the women's club started to develop and they started to play an important role in Muncie society. While we do not know what year Kate exactly got married to William Clark and moved here, we can assume it's sometime before 1900. In 1915, Kate's first husband, William, sadly passes away of pneumonia, and she gets married in September of that year to Taylor Woolf. In 1916, Kate's second marriage was annulled, and we have a little bit of a gap where we don't really know what's going on in her life. We assume this is when she gets pushed out of Muncie, or she just kind of leaves. Because in 1921, the 18th Amendment was passed, making alcohol illegal. In 1927, Kate moved to Indianapolis, and she sadly passed away. So this is just a brief overview of what's going on in Kate's life in terms of the temperance movement, just trying to put it all together. So as stated before, Kate Finney is a product of her time and place. Kate Finney was a working class woman trying to make ends meet. The temperance movement, in my opinion, played a huge role in her life just because she was born into it and that's all she knew. The temperance movement, Kate Finney was a rebel in this case just because she did not fit in what was expected of women at this time. I stated on the last slide, the temperance movement started around 1861 and ended around 1921 and is mainly characterized by white Protestant women. They believed that alcohol was a gateway drug into other evils like prostitution, domestic violence, and ruining reputations via being charged with public intoxication. The temperance movement succeeded by the passing of the 18th Amendment, which made alcohol illegal. And this is after which you could find speakeasies, or as they're known in Muncie as blind tigers, where people make moonshine in their bathtubs and people die of alcohol poisoning because there's no regulation of what's going in their alcohol by the FDA. Even when alcohol was banned, there were still alcohol-related crimes, and I will talk about some of these crimes in the next slide. So these articles are written in favor of the temperance movement. The one on the left says that men have no right to gamble, drink, or debase themselves, and this is just a reflection of the fear that when a woman's husband gets drunk, he has no control over himself. The article on the right is called Temperance Triumphs, and what stood out to me most about the article on the right, as well as some elements of the article on the left, is the quote, "Liquor makes a widow or an orphan in England every 12 minutes. And it reminded me of this journal article that I read, what we decided ultimately not to use in our project, titled The American Temperance Movement and Market-Based Violence by Emily Owens. The reason why we did not use this article is because it's mainly about the economics of the temperance movement, such as supply and demand, and it had a lot of graphs. So the main takeaway is that in the article, if alcohol was illegal, there's going to be more of a demand for it. And so as a result, there's going to be an increase in gang activity, battery, and killings over the illegal alcohol. Speakeasies, like I said, will pop up and people will consume unregulated alcohol. And even if alcohol was regulated and they got it by some kind of legal means, it was expensive. Essentially, when alcohol became illegal, crime went up. However, Owens highlights one of the main reasons why there was a lot of protesting for the banning of alcohol. There's a story about how a father in a drunken rage killed his 3-year-old daughter and did not realize it until it was too late and he was sober. So while Owens does not cite the exact cause of death of the toddler, it's clear that it stuck with a lot of the Protestant women protesting because a lot of them were mothers. So the Protestant women who were protesting the temperance movement essentially took this and just ran with it. The temperance movement essentially was about making sure that Husbands led lives that would appease God and their reputations, and they would not abuse their wives or their kids or anything. All right, so during this period, it's likely that women were expected to get married to a man and have children, and this is seen with In What Middletown Read, with the women's club starting to develop, and this being one of the only places for men to socialize besides church. Having the father look after the children while she was on one of these clubs. This is also seen with many of the arguments about banning alcohol, as I just stated. Alcohol turning husbands into abusive monsters, and they don't know what they're doing, and things like that. So, which I believe is a way to keep their marriage alive. Okay, sorry. Alcohol turned their husbands to abusive monsters, and they wanted to stop that, which I believe is a way to keep their marriage alive. My group and I believe that many women were unhappy with their marriages and the behavior of their husbands. They were too afraid what would happen if they were to get a divorce. Divorce or annulment of marriage was frowned upon just because it did not fit in with what was expected of a woman. With Kate Finney having her first husband, it's unknown if it was frowned upon to get married so quickly after her husband's death. William died early on in 1915, and Kate got married in September of that same year. Again, it's unknown if Kate and Taylor started to date while her husband was dying or not, or if Taylor only liked Kate for her money. Again, that's just speculation. So Kate was essentially ostracized for having a second marriage and then annulling it after a year, just because marriage was supposed to be till death do us part. Divorce is just not in the picture, and this attitude is still carried on today with some people in religions, where marriage is just a lifelong commitment to another person. While attitudes over divorce have changed over the years, in the 1900s, divorce was just a subject of gossip. So many women stayed in unhappy marriages because they wanted their reputation to remain stable. However, if you're Kate Finney and you don't care what kind of gossip went on, what people said about you at the women's club, there's no problem with it. One of the main reasons why divorce was out of the question was the argument, well, how are you going to support yourself? Kate Finney was a working class woman, and many working class women did not have the means to support themselves other than turning to prostitution. They could hypothetically get a job at the new factories, but with unstable conditions, and they probably wouldn't get paid as much as their male co-workers. It was just more efficient to just turn to prostitution. These women could not join the women's clubs just because there was no time to do so. They have to work, and they were outcasted because they did not fit into the housewife mold many women at this time made for themselves. So in conclusion, Kate Finney defied social norms by being a working class woman who went through 2 marriages. She influenced the red light district in Muncie by running her brothel, also known as her joint, near many of the factories. Kate's criminal record is what my group and I first started researching about her. And we found that she would not accept anything from anybody. She was determined to make a profit and ultimately support herself, as many working class women at that time were able to do so. Kate was a hardworking woman who had many of her walls up and not let others in. It was hard for my group to try and get to know who exactly Kate Finney was, and in a way, we still don't know everything about her. We know when she was born and when she died and when she got married, but that's about it. It was such an honor to bring her story to light, as many working women do not get their stories told, especially one as crazy as Kate Finney's. Thank you.
I'm so old, always with the muting. Okay, so sorry, Kara. That was fantastic, and I'm sure that everybody enjoyed your presentation as much as I did. Now that I've unmuted myself and mastered the technology, I'm going to say a few words to sort of bring us all together and highlight a couple of important themes. So clearly those presentations were the result of deep thought and a lot of hard work in gathering sources and working through them. I appreciate how all 3 of you moved from questions to sources to your conclusions, and how you've made that evident to us today. Thank you. I'm sure that our audience will have questions about your process. Now, we also see in your presentations signs of historical significance. All 3 of these presentations took us from very broad national trends down to the regional or the local level. So Virginia, you told us about the furor over trial or companionate marriages, which prompted even a New York Supreme Court justice, Ernest Edgecombe to weigh into the debate in 1924. His dislike of divorce was mirrored in the Legal Aid Society of Chicago's discouragement of that practice, closer to home, closer to Muncie. Hailey, you told us about the national emphasis on women as wives and mothers, and Carrie, you echoed that as well. Reverend C.M. Carter's sermon against divorce at the First Baptist Church in 1899 signals that people in Muncie were concerned about the same issue, even as we see divorces being publicized in the local papers. Carrie, you also noted the popularity of the Women's Christians Temperance Union that emphasized female purity and which mobilized both men and women to preserve it. And it was popular with chapters across the country and absolutely here in Muncie. So let's think about what this tells us. These three case studies from the early 1900s, and I should say that they have their roots in the period before 1900, but we start to see evidence of divorce in the early 1900s. They tell us something about behavior and class. And I'm going to get to that part in a moment. But they also suggest that there was a conflict between what people were doing in the 1870 to 1920 period and how popular culture was slow to acknowledge this increased rate of divorce. Now, Virginia noted the difference between Victorians and people who lived within the Victorian period, and we should remember that what people are doing is not necessarily perfectly aligned with what people are talking about. So quite often when we think about the late 19th century marriage within that time period and women more broadly, we think about the angel in the house. And I'm put in mind of a comment actually that Carrie, you made in the project about the fact that there was sort of nothing in between women with big sleeves and big hair and flappers. So let's think about our historical sort of vision now. The angel in the house was a model that emerged from a poem of the same name, written between 1854 to 62 by Coventry Patmore. And he was a British author who idealized his dead wife, Emily, in a long, and critics often say quite mediocre poem. But it sort of latched on to something in the popular consciousness in the late 1800s. Now, the early 20th century writer Virginia Woolf tells us all we need to know about the angel in the house. Virginia Woolf wrote about her. She was intensely sympathetic. She was immensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed daily. If there was a chicken, she took the leg. If there was a draft, she sat in it. Above all, she was pure. Famously, Woolf goes on to write, "She bothered me and wasted my time and so tormented me that at last I killed her." Now, undoubtedly, that last part is metaphorical, but it suggests that the angel in the house was already dead by 1940 when Woolf was writing this essay. Now, what Woolf doesn't say is that the angel in the house is a deeply middle-class model that required a male breadwinner's support. But anyone reading her essay, which was entitled Professions for Women, likely realized that already. So now let's go back to what I said before, that these presentations describe issues of behavior and class. So Patmore's perfect wife really seems at odds with the middle-class women who formed the Women's Christian Temperance Union and advocated vociferously for prohibition and other social reforms. Indeed, we can imagine that a pure angel like the dead Emily would have no experience of the realities of life that might require reform. And even if she did, she was likely too demure to protest or to organize. We can't really imagine her praying loudly in front of a saloon trying to get it to close, or marching with a placard in a suffrage procession. So now let's do what Kara did. Let's think about chronology. The WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was founded in 1874, and it established a chapter in Muncie in 1881. Patmore's poem was 20 years old by 1881. And by this point, Muncie had a growing array of women's clubs, which laid the groundwork for suffrage campaigns. In the 1910s, Muncie had seven different suffrage leagues. So this was a very popular cause. And in fact, Susie Ryan Marsh, Carrie Gillenwaters' former employer, was the leader in 1912 of the Muncie branch of the Women's Franchise League. The presence of these groups, the suffrage groups, as well as other clubs, suggests that the angel in the house was not a popular model in practice for middle-class women in Muncie. However, its continued currency in the popular imagination through the turn of the century is seen in many satires of club women and suffragettes. It's seen in Justice Edgecombe's comments in 1924 and Reverend Carter's sermon in 1899. In fact, the Muncie Evening Press published a column in 1895 that read, "She may say that she doesn't want to be an angel in the house, but that is what she led man to suppose she was going to be when she married him. And that is why he undertook to support her." Instead, the columnist tells us that the wife wants to write speeches that encourage votes for women. Now, this was published in 1895, long before women get the vote. So the case studies of Anna, Carrie, and Kate show no supportive husbands in this period. After their aborted marriages, evidence suggests that all three women could be described as working class, even if maybe Kate had a much reduced estate of $9,000, but who knows where that went. So this reminds us that marriage and economic status were deeply intertwined at this period. Women with an economically solvent husband, as you all said, were more likely to participate in club life and reform initiatives, and thus change the way that Americans thought about women's behavior, and indeed about divorce. However, persistent behavioral models like the angel in the house, they hide class identity behind concerns about purity and morality. And they make it hard to see real social change. And that's really what Anna, Kate, and Carrie embody in their lives, real social change. So we're left with three very different women from different backgrounds who sit at variance with the popular vision of marriage. Their experiences ending marriages remind historians to watch what people do, in addition to listening to what people say. Okay, so that's the end of my comments. We've got one question in the Q&A. I hope that people in the audience will add more questions there. I'm happy to read them aloud for the presenters to answer. Just before I do, though, I want to come back to what Kara said about hoping to find links between people who were active in their enforcement of these models of behavioral purity and the Defenders of Right and the KKK. And I suspect that Kara was right in what she said about the churches. If you look closely, the churches are where we see people giving lectures. And to give you an example, Daisy Barr is a good person to watch through the 1910s. There's an article by, I think it's Dwight Hoover, who used to be a faculty member here at Ball State in the history department, about Daisy Barr Douglas. And she is a good friend of Carrie Dill Hagman, who was one of this past semester's notable women. They talk about blind tigers and they're clear reformists. And Daisy Barr Douglas draws a large crowd of people at her lectures given in churches in Muncie. She goes on to be a central KKK member, even though she is a woman in the 1920s. And so the Defenders of Right might see themselves as moralists, but, and here we're coming to the newspapers, how do we know who they are? We don't necessarily see people in the newspapers who are behaving, right? People who are living according to the popular model don't necessarily get written up in newspapers, whereas crime and victimization is published. So I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to turn it over to you three. What do you think about that idea that crime and victimization is published, and made widely known. And perhaps those other models fly under the radar problematically.
Well, yeah, I think it is interesting. I also wrote down a note here that, well, first of all, I think it is interesting that all of the ladies we studied had ex-husbands named William, for one. But then I also wrote down that, you know, it's interesting that all of our women had such personal things published about them in local newspapers, you know, whereas nothing was really said about Anna's husband being immoral or anything like that, because he was, you know, hardworking and everything. And it's just interesting how much everyone's or these women's lives were pretty much laid bare for the community to see. But then, you know, we're not talking about the upper class people of Muncie and what are they doing and everything, because they're involved in club life and maybe, yeah, flying under the radar because they're upstanding citizens and we don't want to say anything bad about them.
Yeah, I agree with Haley. It's just like a sense that like the upper class just felt like they were like better, I feel like, than like somebody like Kate Finney. Because Kate Finney's entire second marriage, that whole drama was all in the newspapers, but somebody who was in the Women's Club of Muncie doing questionable stuff wouldn't be highlighted like at all. So it's definitely interesting, just like, oh, we don't care about you, so we're just gonna spill all your personal information.
Yeah, I think especially in relation to the trial marriages and such, if you publish a lot of stories about how there's so many people getting divorces in Muncie and how, you know, the marriage contract is just disintegrating, then that will make people maybe a little more receptive to messages like from the preacher who did a sermon on the dangers of divorce. It makes it more of a real problem in people's eyes.
So we have a question in the Q&A about how you research the red light districts, but also anything sort of below these middle class club women. How do you get at, you know, where the red light districts are, what is happening within them, who is populating them, what is going on? How do we find and sort of bring together information about those lives?
Okay, so I feel like this pertains a lot to me because Kate Finney was very prominent in the Muncie red light district. So for my group, we relied mainly on the newspaper articles written about her, just to be like, oh, well, she was likely located at university, you know, something like that, and then trying to find a Sanborn map about it. But like, we don't know exactly where her brothel or her joint was exactly. So we tried to look at other towns like Chicago and Cincinnati. Like we looked at their Sanborn maps and newspaper about their kinds of prostitutes. That sounds weird, but like prostitutes from there to try to find out, oh, well, they were located by the factories and they were located here and here. So definitely Digital Media Repository was a big help just because of their collection of the Sanborn maps and their collection of the newspaper articles. So it's really hard because, like I said at the end, working women who were prostitutes don't have many sources just to like try to locate them or like, well, what's going on with their, you don't really know just because they don't have time to just sit down and like write a diary. And that was something our mentor, Sophia Hoffert, was trying to talk about. She really wanted to find a diary because she also did Kate Finney when she took the class. And they just didn't have time to write down a diary or anything. So like I said, newspapers, maps, and just looking at other boom towns just to like try to pinpoint where everything was.
Virginia, would you say that the newspapers have sort of a class divide, and that you can work through newspapers to I don't know, to sort of craft understandings of that that other side of the community? What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Very popular things to report on, like who went over to whose house for a gathering or who went to church on Sunday and stuff like that, gives you more of a rounded view of what people were doing in their free time, um, which is important. But I think you also have, with at least the division that I mainly focused on between the white and black community, you have a sort of all of the African American people who went and did their own church socials and they had their own parties and stuff. And then you have the outside community doing the same thing. It's mirrored, um, but it's very contained. And so I think initially I thought that Carrie was in this sort of space that I might associate with upper middle class people, because she was a member of several clubs and she hosted several like sewing circles at her home. But it was the other people that were there with her that we realized it's a completely different section of society from what you would consider the club life circle.
Well, a note that I also wrote down, and this is based on, ideas that I've come to learn since taking Dr. Johnson's history of gender and sexuality class this semester, and where, the readings talked about how white racial purity was kind of the whole purpose of the institution of Christian marriage, that we're supposed to have white Christian marriages and anybody else's marriage isn't really right, or maybe their children aren't as pure, you're never going to be that perfect white Christian person, and it's just interesting how all of like when you're talking about Carrie Gillenwaters, and that all of the articles about her are about her domestic abuse and all of that, but is that just being laid out there because she is an African American woman and because it's trying to invalidate the marriage experience of African American women? Maybe that's why, you know, there's so many articles about her marriages falling apart or something. Just a thought.
So it's hard to get away from considering the impact of the mathematics of these articles. I mean, when you put together the articles about Carrie applying for divorce, citing cruelty and gambling and abuse, and then her arrest and fine for $1 for cutting her husband, when you array those next to she hosted sewing circles, oh, and there was a birthday party, you think, which has the greater impact? Is it the birthday party in which she is seen momentarily according to the model of motherhood that is shared in the community, or is it going to be all of these other really unfortunate incidents? And what is the greater effect on the watching community? It's quite problematic. And we certainly start to wonder if there are racially charged issues, but that would involve looking at the newspaper articles as a much larger sample, and thinking about comparing different groups, different racial groups, divorces, and how they are reported. And well, I think that's really fascinating. I haven't seen anybody do it yet, maybe a future class. Although I remember as I was putting together materials for this semester's History 200 students to work on, I found an article that talked about particularly Asian cultures and Chinese men. And of course, this is an article that was republished in Muncie newspapers, and it was speaking to the predominantly white, predominantly American-born readership, and arguing that Chinese women were really downtrodden, they weren't respected, they were really worked as hard as they could by their husbands. And of course, this forms a vision of Chinese womanhood and manhood in this period that is quite detrimental and not based on individuals at all, doesn't it? So tell me more about what you think. Is print at this time gendered as well as racially charged?
Yes, I think so. Because in all of, just for example, about Anna Lemon Griffin, all of the articles about her threats of violence against her husband and everything, they never, it's never mentioned what he did to provoke that necessarily, or, you know, and the proof is never provided by him that this actually happened, you know, but it makes for a good story because it makes a working woman look bad, you know.
Yeah, I agree. So a lot of Kate Finney's arrest stories were put into the in the newspapers, especially my favorite one where she just threw acid in a guy's face because he didn't pay for his services. It paints her out to be this kind of greedy working woman rather than you didn't pay for your services. Why aren't, you know, she's trying to run a business, and they just try to paint her out as just this greedy woman who will, I don't know, commit acts of violence if you don't carry out what she wants. And it's definitely gendered in that way, I think.
Yeah, when looking into possible gender and race bias in the newspaper, I really wanted to find out if the people who who wrote up the in colored circles section and other like sections in the newspapers, if they were white or African American. And unfortunately, I could never find any record of them, but I know in two instances, the author of the In Colored Circles section is a female. And so to kind of look, I would like to look at the demographics of the people who wrote the newspaper, because obviously we would assume that it's a male dominated environment, print, but there were, you know, female newspaper authors, and it would be interesting to explore that end of things.
I agree completely. And of course, I don't remember her name now, but one of the authors of the In Colored Circles, in later years, she is, well, the community is notified that she and her niece are moving, oh, and I can't remember where. I don't think it's Louisville, but somewhere in that region, maybe it was St. Louis. And she is identified as being African American. So I wondered about whether, uncharitably of me, if she was the token African American on the staff. Hopefully not. But you wonder about how the information moves from the people who are having dinner parties or birthday parties or sewing circles to the newspapers. You don't know. But I'd like to turn more towards your particular experience with sources now. So what was the most challenging thing in your project to figure out, and how did you acquire the sources that would help you do that?
Well, I actually had the added benefit of my mom having an ancestry.com membership that I could log into and look up census records, were helpful, especially in determining, you know, when she was living certain places, like she had officially left Muncie, you know, or was she listed as unemployed and now she's listed as a physician again? So does that mean that she started practicing again? You know, and so the census records helped a lot. We were also able through Ancestry to find, you know, death certificate, marriage certificates, divorce certificates. And then Lauren actually, one of my group members was able to find court documents that were handwritten by Anna Lemon Griffin, and those were also really good sources, just because that's kind of provides her first person point of view on what happened, you know.
So yeah, for my group, we did not have the benefit of having Ancestry.com, so we all had to go to the Muncie Public Library and get library cards because they have free Ancestry access there. So from there, we were able to find census records and her marriage certificates and like that's how we were able to find her obituary, actually, just in that, because I don't. It's really interesting because right before she died, she went by the name Rebecca Dolby, but her obituary is Kate Finney. So it just, that contradiction was just really tough because, like I said, she went by a lot of aliases, so it was just really hard to try to track her down, other than like her newspaper stories in Muncie and stuff like that, and like her scandalous second marriage. That's kind of how we kind of figured out who she was. So yeah, newspaper articles were definitely helpful, and census records were definitely helpful. In addition to like the Sanborn maps, just try to like, maybe she's here, but we're not quite sure.
Yeah, I actually have a tip for the not having Ancestry. There is a website called Family Search that has most of the same databases that Ancestry has. That was very helpful for us. We were only able to find a few sort of cut and dry sources like civil records, and the censuses we had were interesting and useful, but we kind of were suspicious of maybe who was taking down the information for the family, because there were discrepancies between the different decades. But yeah, for us, it was the same. It was mostly newspaper articles, and that added kind of a layer of difficulty because, again, you don't have the person presenting their life, it's somebody else. And that was definitely difficult when you're talking about an African-American woman in Muncie. Like that's was difficult, but we did find our Anna in our group. She went to the architecture department to find all the maps, and we found out where she lived and where she worked. So that was very interesting. And though we weren't able to go to a lot of the physical archive places that we might have liked, due to COVID, everyone was very nice. When you call the place, they're always willing to look for you and stuff. So that was nice.
I will say it was particularly frustrating. Like Kara said, there's just no pictures. And when you're doing a project on somebody, you want to put a face to the name that you're studying. And there just wasn't, I feel like we looked everywhere that we could, and there just weren't any pictures of Anna Lemon Griffin's face, but, a bunch of stuff about how much of a monster she was.
Yeah, I don't know. On that, so there was this lady in Muncie, I think her name was Mary Finney, and that was also frustrating because we wanted to connect them so bad. My group is all about trying to find connections, and we could not connect her because we were like, oh, maybe she's rebelling against her sister or something along those lines, but we weren't able to find any kind of link to that. So it was definitely frustrating, not only with her different aliases, but just with like her last name and things like that.
So different names is an issue too, right? Especially with Finney, because it can be spelt in different ways. At first with Carrie, we thought it was Gillenwater, and sometimes it's Gillenwaters. And Anna Lemon Griffin, is she Anna Minerva? Is she Anna Griffin? You have to be very flexible, don't you, in how you use search terms, and there's a little bit of surprise also in what comes up just with throwaway search terms. Dr. Felker-Cantor has a good question for the three of you. He says, thanks for a great panel. How did you present your research in final form? Dr. DeSilva mentioned Omeka, and how did that format influence the way you told your stories? I think this is an excellent question for pulling out what we're talking about now.
Okay, so we did the project as a group project, and then we made a PowerPoint presentation, which we then recorded one of our group members talking about on Zoom to create somewhat of a documentary on the life using the sources that we found. And the way we formatted ours was we kind of went through a timeline of her life to kind of paint a picture of what her experience was and, you know, the cause and effect that led to those points in her life.
How we did ours was kind of similar. We just had like a PowerPoint and we would talk and then we'd add the audio to the PowerPoint slide so that way people would just like scroll through it and listen to us talk. It really wasn't anything extravagant, but it was just about Muncie, context of Muncie, and how Kate Finney played a role in, you know, how Muncie's starting to develop.
Yeah, our big thing was making sure that whenever one of us added our content or started to design the final product, we were always in communication with one another because we really wanted like a seamless look. We wanted to use photographs that all had the same tone to them. Like we didn't want very sepia photographs or very black and white photographs, to sort of make this more like visually and thematically cohesive project.
Yes, so adding on to that, we actually built our PowerPoint on Microsoft Online so that we could all work on it separately, simultaneously. I mean, it would get jumbled up sometimes where, you know, maybe it saved my version and not Lauren's version, and we have to go back and fix stuff. But for the most part, I think it worked out pretty well because then you don't have to just work on it one slide at a time and then put it all together. It just all kind of fell into place that way.
Can you guys, in the last couple of minutes, talk a little bit about the showing and the telling as historians? Because you all did both in your presentations now, but also in your larger projects.
Well, showing the experience of Anna Lemon Griffin specifically was interesting because, like I've mentioned before, most of the sources that exist about her are about her threatening to chloroform her husband and her, you know, alleged morphine addiction and all of this. And it was kind of interesting, you know, trying to whittle that down and pull in other primary sources that were not about that part of her life to try and kind of determine whether or not she was actually this person that's being portrayed in the media in the, you know, in Muncie at the time. Like, and so our biggest goal was to show that she wasn't just this abusive, addicted woman. She was a respected physician. And, you know, I was really glad that we were able to find the necessary sources to prove that she was more than just a morphine addict who threatened to kill her husband.
Yeah, it was, like I said, with all the different identities that Kate Finney had, it was definitely hard for like the showing just to try to like keep them all straight because we couldn't find any newspapers with her where she was like, when she was Rebecca Dolby, like we didn't know where to find that. There were some where she was Catherine Clark and Catherine Woolf, but those were just divorce and, oh, her husband died. So it was definitely hard to try to find those. And yeah, so for the showing and the telling, it was, like Hailey said, trying to pull all the primary sources together to try to paint Kate Finney as this businesswoman. She wasn't just a prostitute who would commit acts of violence. She was trying to support herself in a time when women couldn't really support themselves.
Yeah, I think we all felt incredibly lucky because we assumed we wouldn't be able to tell more of a linear story. We assumed that there wouldn't be a lot of information about Carrie's life, so we would have to use other women to kind of demonstrate what she might have experienced, which we did end up doing in some cases. But her life was incredibly interesting. And so we were just so excited to go through like the story of all the different things that impacted her life. It ended up being like feeling like we were telling a story and not like we were just going through these little facts about someone that may or may not relate to the wider world.
So that really is the historian's work, isn't it? Knitting a narrative out of sources, framing it with context, ensuring that the reader or the watcher is able to understand how people lived within the society that talked about them and set them against models that may or may not apply in practice. And you, all three of you and your collaborators did fantastic work. You should be very proud, and I'm very proud of you. You've given extraordinary presentations today. Thank you everyone on the panel and attendees for joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the Notable Women Project, you can check out all 6 biography videos on the Town on Fire Omeka exhibit online. But also you can attend tomorrow's 1 p.m. session chaired by Dr. Connolly. It's entitled Notable Women of Muncie, Agency and Action. And on that note, I'll say goodbye to everyone and thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you.